the lights still turn on every night. Marble floors reflect ceilings that were never looked up at. Elevators wait in silence, programmed for crowds that never arrived. Behind glass walls, furniture sits untouched, aligned exactly as designers intended. Outside, roads curve toward entrances no one has ever used. This project wasn't interrupted. It wasn't damaged. It wasn't delayed. It was finished, exactly as planned. Billions were spent to remove uncertainty, to engineer success, to eliminate risk. And yet, once the final inspection passed, the project was quietly abandoned. So the real question isn't why it failed. The question is harder. Was this luxury project abandoned, or was it never viable the moment it was completed? When the final construction crews left, every metric said this project had won. The numbers told a story of triumph. Square footage delivered precisely to specification. Materials sourced from manufacturers across 3 continents. Systems, integrated and tested. Every milestone hit, every target met. The architectural renderings had promised towers rising from desert sand, glass and steel, catching sunlight at angles calculated for maximum visual impact. What emerged matched those renderings exactly. The towers stood, the glass reflected, the angles worked. Inside, finishes met luxury standards that would satisfy the most demanding buyers. Italian marble in lobbies, German fixtures in bathrooms, kitchens equipped with appliances whose model numbers appeared in design magazines, wood flooring harvested from specific forests, selected for grain patterns that created subtle visual rhythm across expansive rooms. The infrastructure beneath these surfaces represented engineering at scale. Cooling systems designed for extreme heat, water treatment plants processing thousands of gallons daily, backup generators capable of powering entire buildings, fiber optic networks threaded through walls, security systems monitoring every corridor, every entrance, every vulnerable point. Construction had consumed years. Contracts were signed with suppliers in Milan, Frankfurt, Shanghai. Craftsmen were flown in for specialized work. Stone cutters, metal workers, teams trained in systems so complex they required certification. The project employed thousands at peak activity. Workers moved through rotations covering every hour. Concrete poured, steel welded, glass installed panel by panel, each piece fitted to tolerances measured in millimeters. Quality control operated in layers. Inspectors verified materials before installation. Systems were tested repeatedly. Final walkthroughs documented every detail. The checklist for a single residential unit ran to hundreds of items. When completion arrived, the developer held a private event for investors and partners. Guests walked through model units staged to demonstrate lifestyle potential. Furniture arranged by professionals who specialized in aspirational living. Art on walls. Books on shelves. Every element calculated to project the life this project promised. Champagne was served, speeches delivered. Representatives from construction firms, design studios, and financial institutions congratulated one another. Years of planning, negotiation, and execution had reached their conclusion. The project was done. And then nothing happened. This wasn't built by dreamers, it was built by institutions. The developer was a corporation with projects across multiple continents. Public filings listed assets in the billions. The executive team included veterans of real estate development in markets from Dubai to Singapore to Miami. These were professionals who understood construction timelines, financing structures, regulatory environments. Funding came from multiple sources. A consortium of banks provided construction loans backed by detailed financial models. Private equity firms took positions drawn by projected returns that appeared conservative relative to comparable projects. Sovereign wealth funds allocated capital treating the development as one position in diversified portfolios spanning infrastructure, real estate, and strategic assets. The financial architecture was sophisticated. Senior debt carried priority claims against assets. Mezzanine financing filled the gap between conservative bank lending and required capital. Equity investors accepted higher risk in exchange for proportionally higher returns if projections proved accurate. Risk assessment went through multiple layers. Engineering consultants evaluated technical feasibility. Market analysts projected absorption rates based on demographic data and comparable sales. Legal teams structured entities to protect investors from cascading liability. Insurance wrapped specific risks into policies underwritten by global carriers. Every decision point generated documentation. Feasibility studies ran to hundreds of pages. Market reports analyzed buyer profiles with statistical precision. Environmental impact assessments addressed water usage, energy consumption, waste management. Traffic studies modeled vehicle flows at multiple time horizons. The project was not a gamble. It was a calculated deployment of capital based on assumptions that appeared robust when examined through conventional frameworks. Investment committees at major financial institutions reviewed proposals and voted approval. Pension funds, insurance companies, and endowments allocated portions of portfolios to this project alongside office towers in London, logistics centres in Rotterdam, residential developments in Seoul. This was professional real estate development operating at institutional scale. The participants were not amateurs pursuing vanity projects. They were experienced operators deploying strategies that had generated returns in previous cycles. The location was selected through systematic analysis. Population growth projections indicated demand. Infrastructure investment by government created accessibility. Regulatory environment offered incentives for development. Climate attracted wealthy buyers seeking specific lifestyle amenities. Land was assembled from multiple parcels. Negotiations extended over years as individual plots were purchased or optioned. The process involved local landowners, government entities controlling certain tracts, and coordination with utilities to ensure services could be extended. Permitting required navigation of bureaucratic processes that varied by jurisdiction. Environmental clearances, building approvals, infrastructure agreements. Each stage demanded legal expertise, technical documentation, and patient engagement with regulatory authorities. Architects were selected through competitions. Design teams presented concepts that balanced aesthetic ambition with construction feasibility. The winning proposal offered towers that would photograph well, interiors that could be marketed to international buyers, and systems that could be built within budget. Construction contracts were bid competitively. General contractors submitted proposals backed by subcontractor commitments. Pricing was verified through independent cost estimators. Payment schedules were structured to align incentives and manage risk. Project management operated through established methodologies. Critical path scheduling identified dependencies. Weekly progress meetings tracked milestones. Change orders were evaluated for cost and schedule impact. Safety protocols reduced accident risk. Marketing began before construction completed. Sales galleries were established in major cities. Brochures were printed in multiple languages. Websites featured virtual tours. Sales teams were trained to present lifestyle narratives that connected product features to buyer aspirations. The target market was defined precisely. High net worth individuals seeking secondary residences, wealthy retirees relocating to favorable tax and climate environments, investors purchasing for rental income or appreciation, families wanting luxury vacation properties. Pricing was calibrated to comparable projects. Per square foot figures aligned with recent sales in similar developments. Premium finishes justified premium pricing. Amenities package differentiated the project from competition. Deposits were collected. Purchase agreements were signed. A certain number of units sold during construction validating market assumptions and providing early cash flow. Every indicator suggested the project would succeed. The institutions building it had succeeded before. The systems deployed were proven. The market existed. Completion was meant to unlock value. Buyers would close. Occupancy would rise. The project would become a functioning luxury residential community, generating the returns that financial models predicted. Completion came exactly as scheduled. And then the mechanism stopped. The problem wasn't the numbers. It was what the numbers assumed. Every financial model, every market analysis, every feasibility study rested on a foundation. The foundation was simple. People who could afford this product would want to live here. The assumption appeared safe. Luxury real estate in desirable locations had performed reliably for decades. Wealthy buyers consistently sought properties offering specific amenities, climate advantages, or lifestyle enhancements. Markets from Monaco to Miami to Hong Kong demonstrated that high-net-worth individuals would pay premium prices for premium product. The data supported the assumption. Population surveys identified tens of thousands of households with sufficient wealth. A fraction of that population purchasing units would fill the project. Even conservative capture rates produced viable absorption timelines. Comparable projects provided validation. Developments in nearby regions had sold successfully. Price points per square foot in this project fell within ranges proven achievable. Amenities packages matched or exceeded what competitors offered. The assumption extended beyond simple demand. It included specific characteristics about that demand. Buyers would accept the location despite its isolation because luxury amenities would compensate. The project offered restaurants, fitness facilities, pools, landscaped grounds. Everything necessary for comfortable living existed on site. Distance from urban centers would be reframed as privacy and exclusivity. Buyers would accept property prices calculated to cover development costs plus acceptable returns. The pricing was premium but justified by quality finishes, architectural distinction, and amenity access. Wealthy buyers focused on value proposition, not absolute cost. Buyers would commit despite limited local employment or cultural infrastructure. This was residential real estate, not a primary residence for most buyers. People purchasing vacation homes or investment. Properties did not require proximity to offices or cultural institutions. Buyers would generate organic demand through network effects. Early purchasers would recommend the project to peers. Occupancy would create social validation. The development would become a destination through accumulated presence of desirable residents. These assumptions were not invented arbitrarily. They reflected patterns observed in successful projects. Isolated resort communities had worked when amenities were sufficient. Luxury real estate had commanded premium pricing when product quality justified it. Wealthy buyers had accepted inconvenience when compensated by privacy or natural beauty. But assumptions derived from past patterns carry an embedded risk. They work until conditions shift. The first condition was supply. Luxury real estate development had accelerated globally. Projects targeting similar demographics launched simultaneously across multiple regions. Wealthy buyers faced expanding choices. Scarcity, which had supported pricing in previous decades, was eroding. The second condition was preference. Wealthy households were increasingly prioritizing urban proximity over isolation. Access to dining, culture, education, and medical care mattered more as populations aged. Younger, wealthy buyers showed preference for walkable neighborhoods over gated resort compounds. The third condition was utility. Vacation home ownership was declining among demographics that historically supported such purchases. Wealthy families were substituting luxury hotels and short-term rentals for owned properties. The carrying costs, maintenance responsibility, and management burden of second homes were being questioned. The fourth condition was investment logic. Real estate as wealth preservation worked when appreciation could be reasonably expected. But luxury property in isolated locations lacked the liquidity and value stability of urban assets. Investors were recognizing that trophy real estate often performed poorly relative to alternative investments. Each condition was identifiable before the project completed. Market research captured some signals. Industry reports noted shifting preferences. But the weight of institutional momentum carried the project forward. Assumptions that appeared solid were actually contingent. They depended on market conditions remaining stable. They depended on buyer preferences staying constant. They depended on supply not overwhelming demand. The numbers said the project should work, but numbers reflect the assumptions fed into them. Garbage in, garbage out. The models were precise. The assumptions were wrong. What killed the project wasn't miscalculation, it was misunderstanding. The builders knew how to construct luxury real estate. They knew how to finance large projects. They knew how to manage construction. What they didn't know was whether the people they built this for actually wanted it. By the time that question could be answered definitively, the project was finished. Billions had been spent. Systems were installed, interiors were complete, and the market delivered its verdict. Luxury doesn't create demand. It waits for it. The project opened sales with confidence. Marketing campaigns ran in major cities. Sales teams hosted tours. Units were staged to showcase potential. The pitch was polished. Own a piece of exclusive paradise. Invest in a lifestyle others could only dream about. Initial interest appeared promising. Wealthy individuals scheduled visits. Some walked through model units, admired finishes, asked questions about amenities. A handful made deposits. Then momentum stalled. Conversations with potential buyers revealed a pattern. The project was impressive. The quality was evident. The amenities were substantial. But something was missing. For some, the location felt too remote. Flying in required connections through secondary airports. Driving from major cities consumed hours. The isolation that marketing positioned as privacy felt like inconvenience. For others, the absence of surrounding community was disqualifying. No established restaurants beyond the project's own facilities. No cultural venues. No organic street life. The development sat alone, impressive but solitary. For investors, the analysis turned cold. Rental demand was uncertain in a location without business travelers or tourism infrastructure. Appreciation potential was questionable. Comparable sales data was thin. Liquidity risk was high. Better opportunities existed elsewhere. The wealthy buyers this project needed were selective. They had options. They had experience. They had advisors who evaluated purchases through financial and practical lenses. Luxury finishes and architectural ambition were necessary but not sufficient. Wealthy individuals could find marble countertops and floor-to-ceiling windows in multiple markets. What they couldn't find was a compelling reason to choose this location over alternatives that offered urban proximity, cultural richness, or established social networks. The project's amenities, extensive though they were, competed against cities offering vastly more. A fitness center and pool were pleasant, but couldn't replace the restaurants, theaters, galleries, and social infrastructure of established communities. Marketing pivoted. Messaging emphasized different angles. Privacy became the focus. Then exclusivity. Then investment potential. Each campaign generated modest inquiry. None generated sales velocity. Sales teams reported consistent feedback. Buyers were impressed during tours. But they didn't commit. The distance between admiration and purchase remained unbridged. Pricing adjustments were considered. Perhaps the units were overpriced relative to demonstrated demand. But lowering prices created problems. Construction loans were sized assuming specific revenue. Financial models required certain average sale prices to hit return thresholds. Investors had committed capital expecting defined outcomes. Price reductions would trigger renegotiations with lenders. Equity investors would question projections and potentially demand restructuring. Early buyers who had paid full price would feel deceived. The entire financial architecture was calibrated to a specific pricing level. More fundamentally, price wasn't the primary barrier. Wealthy buyers weren't refusing because they couldn't afford the units. They were refusing because the value proposition didn't justify the commitment regardless of price. Lowering a price from $5 million to $4 million doesn't address the problem if the fundamental question is, why would I want to live here? The project needed occupants who would create community. Empty towers couldn't generate the social proof necessary to attract others. Wealthy buyers wanted to join thriving communities, not pioneer vacant ones. But without initial occupants, community couldn't form. And without community, subsequent buyers wouldn't commit. The project was trapped in a bootstrapping paradox. Months passed, marketing continued, sales teams pursued leads, units sat empty. The gap between completion and viable occupancy widened. The market was delivering a message. The message was simple. This project didn't match what wealthy buyers actually wanted. It matched what developers assumed wealthy buyers wanted. Luxury without demand is just expensive emptiness. Materials are still marble. Systems still function. But without people, it's architecture waiting for purpose. The towers stood perfect and vacant. Lights on timers created the illusion of occupancy. But no one was coming home. The very size meant to guarantee success made failure unavoidable. The project was designed at scale to capture economies. Bulk material purchasing reduced per-unit costs. Shared amenities spread expenses across hundreds of buyers. Infrastructure investment was justified by projected absorption. Scale offered financial advantages during construction. Large projects attracted institutional capital. Lenders valued diversification across many units rather than concentration in a few. Contractors bid competitively for substantial contracts. But scale carried embedded assumptions about demand. Building 500 units assumed 500 buyer households existed and could be converted to purchases within a reasonable timeline. The assumption proved optimistic. Demand existed, but not at the depth or pace required. Perhaps 200 households would eventually purchase. Perhaps 300 over a very extended period. But 500? The market couldn't absorb that supply at this location. Had the project been smaller, say 100 units, failure modes would differ. Sales could stretch over longer timelines without triggering crisis. Operating costs would be proportionally lower. The development could function as a boutique property, exclusive, precisely because it was limited. But at 500 units, mathematics became punishing. Each vacant unit represented sunk construction cost generating zero revenue. Amenities built to serve hundreds of residents had to be maintained regardless of actual occupancy. Infrastructure designed for community-scale population ran at a fraction of capacity. Fixed costs dominated. The cooling systems, water treatment, security, landscaping, and common area maintenance continued, regardless of how many units sold. These costs were budgeted assuming they'd be spread across hundreds of paying residents. With low occupancy, per-unit costs spiraled. The project needed critical mass to function as designed. Restaurants required customers. Fitness centers required members. Retail space required shoppers. At 10% occupancy, none of these facilities could operate viably. At 20%, they still struggled. Closing amenities to cut costs would undermine the value proposition. Buyers were paying premium prices for access to comprehensive services. Without those services, the units lost differentiation. The development faced a trap. It couldn't afford to maintain full amenities with low occupancy. But it couldn't attract occupancy without maintaining amenities. Scale that was meant to generate efficiency instead generated obligation that couldn't be met. Carrying costs accumulated. Property taxes were assessed on completed construction, not on revenue generated. The government didn't care if units were occupied. The assessment was based on what existed, and what existed was hundreds of completed luxury units. Insurance protected against physical damage and liability. Premiums were calculated on replacement value and risk exposure. Empty buildings still required coverage. In some respects, vacant properties carried higher premiums due to risks specific to unoccupied structures. Debt service continued. Construction loans converted to permanent financing, or were meant to upon stabilization. But stabilization required occupancy and revenue. With sales stalled, the project remained in a gray zone between construction and operation, accumulating interest without generating offsetting income. The financial structure assumed a trajectory. Construction would complete, sales would accelerate, units would close, and cash would flow. That cash would service debt, cover operations, and eventually generate returns. The trajectory didn't materialize. Sales remained sporadic. Closings trickled rather than flowed. Cash generation fell short of projections by margins that widened monthly. Smaller projects allow flexibility. A developer with 20 units can adjust strategy, target niche buyers, or pivot to different uses. But 500 units in towers designed for residential luxury offered limited flexibility. The physical form was locked in. The cost structure was fixed. Scale had been chosen deliberately to optimize returns under success scenarios. But optimization for success created vulnerability to failure. The project was engineered for a specific outcome. When that outcome didn't occur, the entire mechanism seized. The developer faced choices. Pour additional capital into marketing and operations, hoping extended effort would eventually reach critical mass. Restructure debt, likely taking significant losses and diluting or wiping out equity. Sell the project at a discount to another operator willing to gamble on different strategies. None of these options were attractive. Additional capital deepened exposure to an asset that wasn't performing. Restructuring meant acknowledging failure to lenders and investors. Selling crystallized losses and meant admitting the project as conceived was not viable. So the project lingered. Maintained at minimum levels. Marketed with diminishing energy. Held in a state between operation and abandonment. The scale that was supposed to be an advantage had become an anchor. Too big to save, too expensive to maintain, too illiquid to exit. 500 units in towers on empty land, built to house thousands of people who never arrived. What killed the project wasn't who was there. It was who never arrived. The financial models assumed a target demographic. High net worth individuals aged 45 to 75. Wealth derived from business ownership, professional success, or inheritance. Geographic distribution across major cities in North America, Europe, and Asia. This demographic was real. Surveys confirmed that hundreds of thousands of households met wealth thresholds. These households purchased vacation properties, invested in real estate, and sought luxury goods and services. But aggregated demographics obscure specifics. Within the broad category of high net worth individuals, preferences varied dramatically. Some wanted urban penthouses, others wanted mountain retreats. Some prioritized proximity to grandchildren, others prioritized golf, courses. The project needed a specific subset. Wealthy buyers who wanted luxury residential property in an isolated location, who could overlook the absence of surrounding community, who valued architectural quality and amenity access enough to accept inconvenience. That subset existed, but it was smaller than projections assumed. Much smaller. Moreover, that subset was shrinking. Generational wealth transfer was moving assets to younger inheritors whose preferences differed from their parents. Younger wealthy buyers prioritized experiences over ownership. They wanted access without obligation. They preferred hotel suites to second homes, ride services to owned vehicles, rental luxury to owned property. The demographic shift wasn't dramatic enough to appear in short-term data, but it was steady. Each year, the pool of buyers who wanted what this project offered diminished slightly, while the pool who preferred alternatives grew. The project needed what economists call a thick market. Enough buyers and sellers that transactions occur reliably, prices stabilize, and liquidity exists. Thin markets are characterized by sporadic activity, wide bid-ask spreads, and uncertainty about value. Luxury real estate in isolated locations is inherently thin. Buyers are rare. Transactions are infrequent. Establishing market value is difficult because comparable sales are sparse. The project compounded this challenge by adding supply to an already thin market. It wasn't filling existing demand. It was hoping to create demand through product quality. Sometimes product quality does create demand. A superior offering convinces buyers they want something they didn't know they wanted. But this requires that the product solve a problem or fulfill a desire buyers recognize. The project offered luxury and amenities, but it didn't solve any problem wealthy buyers actually had. They could already access luxury. They already had amenities. What the project offered was more of what they could get elsewhere, in a location less convenient than alternatives. The missing population wasn't a demographic that existed but chose other options. It was a demographic that never existed in sufficient numbers. The project was built for a market that was a projection, not a reality. This wasn't ignorance, it was optimism. Models used capture rates drawn from successful projects. If Project A in Market B achieved a certain penetration rate, then surely Project C in Market D could achieve similar results. But markets aren't uniform. Success in one context doesn't transfer automatically to another. Location matters, timing matters, competitive landscape matters. The project launched during a period of expanding luxury supply. Similar developments opened in multiple regions simultaneously. The buyers who might have considered this project had more options than ever. Each option divided the limited pool of interested households. At the same time, economic uncertainty made discretionary purchases more carefully considered. Wealthy households weren't facing hardship, but they were questioning whether second homes made sense. Carrying costs, maintenance burdens, and limited usage raised doubts. Market research captured some of this. Focus groups expressed hesitation about isolated locations. Surveys showed declining interest in vacation home ownership, but research also showed residual demand, and that residual demand appeared sufficient if conservatively modeled. The gap between research findings and actual behavior revealed a truth about stated preferences versus revealed preferences. People say they want things they don't actually buy. Surveys capture aspirations. Sales capture decisions. The project needed real decisions, not aspirational interest. It needed people to write checks, sign contracts, and commit to ownership. That commitment never materialized at necessary scale. The development waited for a population that existed primarily in spreadsheets. The towers stood ready, the units were complete, but the residents who were supposed to fill them were elsewhere, living different lives, making different choices. Geography without people is just landscape. Architecture without occupants is just structure. The project had both. What it lacked was the human element that would transform it from impressive construction into functioning community. The missing population wasn't coming. And without them, everything else was irrelevant. The moment it was finished, the clock started running backward. Completion is not an end state. It's a transition from construction to operation. And operation for physical structures means continuous battle against entropy. The project opened with systems in pristine condition. Cooling equipment ran efficiently. Elevators operated smoothly. Paint was fresh. Seals were tight. Everything functioned as designed because everything was new. But age begins immediately. Mechanical systems accumulate operating hours. Materials face weathering. Components wear. Maintenance transforms from future concern to present obligation the day after final inspection. The operating budget itemized categories that would consume cash perpetually. Climate control systems required scheduled servicing, filter replacements, refrigerant checks, motor inspections. Manufacturers specified maintenance intervals. Skipping them voided warranties and risked failures. Elevators demanded monthly inspections and annual certifications. Safety systems needed testing. Cables required examination for wear. Control systems received software updates. Each elevator had minimum maintenance costs regardless of usage frequency. Landscaping required continuous attention. Irrigation systems pressurized daily to keep plantings alive in arid climate. Turf needed mowing, fertilizing, pest control. Trees and shrubs required pruning. Seasonal plantings refreshed color. A dozen workers moved through grounds, year-round. Water treatment plants processed flows to maintain quality. Operators monitored systems for chemistry, pressure, and contamination. Replacement filters, chemical additives, and energy consumption generated ongoing costs. Security patrols ran 24 hours. Guards rotated shifts covering gates, common areas, and perimeters. Surveillance systems required monitoring. Access control equipment needed maintenance. Even with low occupancy, security couldn't be reduced without compromising safety and insurance compliance. Common areas were cleaned on schedules regardless of use. Lobbies received daily attention, hallways weekly, windows monthly. Vacant units were inspected regularly to detect leaks, pest intrusion, or unauthorized access. Utilities continued. Electricity-powered elevators, pumps, lighting, and climate control. Water cycled through systems to prevent stagnation. Gas-fueled backup generators tested monthly. Communications infrastructure remained active to support security and management systems. Property taxes arrived annually. Assessments reflected completed construction value. Appeals could adjust figures at the margins, but not eliminate the obligation. The local government didn't discount taxes for vacancy. Insurance premiums protected against fire, flood, liability, and dozens of specified risks. Carriers calculated premiums on replacement cost and occupancy status. Empty buildings sometimes carried higher premiums due to delayed detection of damage and increased vulnerability to vandalism. The scale of the project amplified every line item. One building with these obligations was manageable. 5 buildings multiplied costs accordingly. Each tower had its own systems requiring maintenance. Each common area needed servicing. Each acre of landscaping demanded care. The budget assumed operating costs would be covered by resident fees. Homeowners association dues, service charges, and assessment fees would pool to fund maintenance. But those fees required occupants. With 10% occupancy, revenue covered perhaps 15% of costs. The gap had to be funded from other sources. Operating losses accumulated monthly. The developer initially covered shortfalls from reserves, expecting sales would eventually close the gap. Months became quarters. Quarters became years. Reserves depleted. Cutting maintenance became tempting. Defer landscaping upgrades, stretch service intervals, reduce cleaning frequency, but deferred maintenance compounded. Small problems escalated into large ones. Neglected systems failed catastrophically rather than degrading predictably. The project had been built to luxury standards requiring luxury-level maintenance. Reducing maintenance meant quality decline. Quality decline meant the remaining value proposition eroded. The project couldn't afford to maintain its standards, but it couldn't afford not to. Mechanical systems began showing stress as usage patterns deviated from design assumptions. Equipment engineered for continuous operation struggled with intermittent use. Seals dried. Fluids separated. Corrosion accelerated in inactive systems. Climate control systems sized for full occupancy ran inefficiently, serving empty buildings. Cooling entire towers to maintain vacant units consumed energy without purpose. But allowing temperatures to rise risked damage to finishes and infrastructure. The project was trapped in a thermodynamic prison. Maintaining order required continuous energy input. Without that input, entropy accelerated. But the energy required exceeded what the project's economics could support. Annual maintenance costs for the entire development ran into 8 figures. That number appeared manageable when divided across 500 occupied units. But divided across 50 occupied units, it was catastrophic. The operating budget became a countdown. How long before reserves exhausted? How long before lenders lost patience? How long before systems started failing from deferred maintenance? Each month that passed brought the project closer to a point where deterioration would become visible. Once that threshold crossed, even potential buyers who might have considered units would see a property in decline. The clock kept running. Systems kept aging. Costs kept accumulating. And every day the project moved further from its pristine completion state toward something harder to define. Not quite abandoned, not quite operational. Somewhere between, slowly sliding towards the former. Lowering the price would have rewritten the story investors told themselves. The straightforward response to stalled sales is price adjustment. If buyers aren't materializing at current pricing, reduce prices until demand emerges. Economics 101, price discovery through supply and demand equilibrium. But this project couldn't follow that logic. Price wasn't just a number. It was embedded in a web of financial commitments and psychological narratives. Construction loans were secured against projected revenues. Lenders had approved financing based on pro forma statements showing specific per-unit average sale prices. Those prices generated cash flows that serviced debt according to agreed schedules. Reducing prices meant reducing projected revenues. Reduced revenues meant debt service coverage ratios falling below covenanted levels. Falling below covenants triggered technical defaults. Technical defaults gave lenders rights to demand immediate repayment, force asset sales, or take control. Renegotiating with lenders was theoretically possible, but it required admitting that original projections were wrong. It meant subordinating existing equity investors to new capital that would demand control. It meant lenders converting from secured creditors into effective owners. Every party at the table had incentives to avoid that conversation. The developer wanted to avoid admitting failure and losing control. Lenders wanted to avoid realizing losses on impaired loans. Equity investors wanted to avoid acknowledging their investment was underwater. So prices stayed elevated even as reality diverged from projections. Units that should have been priced at $3 million remained listed at $5 million. Not because $5 million reflected market value, but because $3 million would unravel the financial structure. Price maintenance served another function. It protected early buyers who had purchased at full price. These buyers, though few, were stakeholders. If units suddenly listed at substantial discounts, early purchasers would feel betrayed. Some might have legal recourse claiming fraudulent inducement. All would be vocal critics. Marketing new units at reduced prices while existing owners held units purchased at premium prices would create community tension. The few occupied units would house owners who felt they'd overpaid. Their dissatisfaction would permeate the development, deterring future buyers. Price reductions also carried signaling risk. In real estate markets, especially luxury segments, price reflects perceived quality. Expensive properties are assumed to be superior. Discounting signals distress, quality issues, or market rejection. Wealthy buyers are particularly sensitive to these signals. They don't want to purchase assets that markets have rejected. They want assets that others desire. Scarcity and exclusivity drive luxury appeal. Discounts undermine both. The project couldn't afford to be seen as desperate. Desperation repels precisely the buyers needed. Luxury consumers want to join winners, not rescue failures. So marketing maintained aspirational messaging. Unit prices stayed firm. Sales materials emphasized quality, amenities, and lifestyle. The narrative was exclusive opportunity, not distressed sale. This stance required ignoring market feedback. Buyers weren't materializing at current prices. That feedback suggested prices were wrong. But acknowledging that would cascade through financial structures and market positioning with consequences management wasn't prepared to accept. Psychology played a role beyond financial mechanics. The development team had invested years in this project. Reducing prices felt like admitting defeat. Every professional involved had reputations tied to success. Price cuts would be public acknowledgement that their assumptions were wrong. Cognitive biases reinforced resistance to repricing. Sunk cost fallacy made it hard to accept that money already spent was gone, regardless of future decisions. Commitment escalation made doubling down on the original strategy feel better than changing course. The project was trapped in a psychological and financial equilibrium. Prices couldn't fall without triggering structural collapse. But prices at current levels weren't generating sales. The only solution was waiting, hoping that time would eventually bring buyers willing to pay what the project needed. That hope grew thinner with each passing month. Markets don't stand still. Alternative properties came online. Buyer preferences evolved. The window in which this project could have succeeded, if it ever existed, was closing. But admitting that required conversations no one wanted to have. So prices stayed where they were. Units remained listed. And the gap between asking prices and market reality widened into a chasm that couldn't be bridged without breaking everything holding the project together. The numbers on listing sheets bore less relationship to market value than to the collective fiction necessary to avoid facing failure. No announcement marked the end. Just fewer visits. The signs were subtle initially. The developers' representatives who had been on site weekly started appearing monthly, then quarterly. Marketing staff who had conducted regular tours were reassigned to other projects. Sales gallery hours contracted from 7 days to 5, then to appointment only. Investor update calls, once monthly, became sporadic. When they did occur, the tone shifted from optimistic to neutral to carefully vague. Specific sales projections disappeared from presentations, replaced by references to ongoing marketing efforts and continuing interest. Lenders who had been monitoring progress closely settled into a different posture. Rather than pushing for aggressive action, they opted for patience. Foreclosing on the property made no sense. The bank didn't want to own a partially occupied luxury development in an isolated location. Better to let the situation stabilize or wait for market conditions to improve. Equity investors faced similar calculus. Capital was already deployed and largely lost. Forcing a sale would crystallize losses. Perhaps time would eventually allow recovery of something. In the meantime, it was easier to stop thinking about it, to move attention to other investments showing more promise. The withdrawal was collective and uncoordinated. No formal decision was made. No meeting occurred where stakeholders agreed to step back. Instead, each party independently concluded that active engagement wasn't producing results and wasn't worth continued effort. Construction loans were restructured into longer-term facilities with extended maturity dates. This kicked the problem forward, avoiding immediate crisis while acknowledging that original timelines wouldn't be met. Interest accrued, added to principal balances that continued growing despite lack of sales. Maintenance was reduced to minimum defensible levels. Landscaping shifted from ornamental to merely adequate. Common areas were cleaned less frequently. Amenities facilities, built but barely used, were closed temporarily. The sales gallery was closed and furniture removed. Asking prices remained officially unchanged, but the energy behind sales efforts dissipated. The website stayed active, displaying units and amenities, but no one actively marketed them. Inquiries received responses, but follow-up was perfunctory. The few occupied units housed owners who had purchased in the project's optimistic early phase. They inhabited a strange environment. Common areas they had expected to share with hundreds of neighbors stayed empty. Amenities they had paid premium prices to access sat idle or closed. These residents became unintentional documentarians of abandonment. They watched as activity declined. Fewer staff visible. Fewer lights in other towers. Fewer cars in parking areas. The development they had bought into was dissolving around them. Some considered their options. Selling meant accepting substantial losses. Units couldn't be sold for anything approaching purchase prices. Holding meant living in an increasingly ghostly environment, while paying maintenance fees that covered only a fraction of actual costs. A few tried to organize remaining owners. Perhaps collective action could force management to address problems. But the owners were scattered geographically, used the property infrequently, and had limited leverage. Management was itself constrained by financial realities beyond individual influence. The quiet withdrawal continued. Each stakeholder retreated to a defensive posture, protecting remaining interests while minimizing further exposure. The project hadn't collapsed. It had simply been set aside, placed in a holding pattern, while everyone involved hoped that somehow, eventually, conditions would change. But conditions weren't changing. The fundamental problem, a product that didn't match market demand, remained unsolved. Time wasn't healing. It was allowing deterioration. The project entered a twilight state, not abandoned in the technical sense, still owned, still maintained at minimum levels, still theoretically for sale, but effectively frozen, existing in a limbo between operation and obsolescence. The towers stood. Lights stayed on. Systems ran. But the human activity that would have justified all of it never arrived. And gradually, without announcement or acknowledgement, the project transitioned from development to artifact. Completion didn't open the project. It closed it. The paradox was complete. Everything built to enable occupancy instead prevented it. The more finished the project became, the less viable it was. During construction, the project existed as potential. Buyers purchased based on renderings, promises, and imagination. They invested in a future state that could be perfect because it didn't yet exist. But completion replaced potential with reality. And reality couldn't compete with imagination. The finished units were impressive by objective measures. Finishes were high quality. Layouts were functional. Views were dramatic. But they were also empty, generic, and waiting. They didn't feel like homes. They felt like displays. Model units staged by professionals created aspirational atmospheres through careful curation. But the stagecraft was visible. The books were props. The art was rental. The whole presentation was theater. Buyers touring completed units faced a different experience than buyers touring models during construction. During construction, imperfections could be attributed to ongoing work. Empty spaces could be filled with imagination. Unfinished elements created anticipation. Completed units removed those buffers. Everything was visible and judgeable. The reality was marble and fixtures and appliances. High quality, certainly, but not magical, not transformative, not worth $5 million in an isolated location. The project had been designed to be impressive at scale, towers working in composition, landscaping connecting buildings, amenities creating destination appeal. But without occupancy to activate that vision, the scale became oppressive. Walking through empty towers was an eerie experience. Corridors stretched silent. Elevators opened to empty hallways. Behind locked doors, perfect units waited in darkness. The architecture that was meant to house thriving community instead framed absence. Common areas were particularly haunting. A restaurant with no diners, a fitness center with no members, a pool area with no swimmers. These spaces were designed around human activity. Without it, they were stage sets missing actors. The project illustrated a truth about luxury real estate. Luxury is context-dependent. A penthouse in a vibrant urban building is luxurious because it offers access to city life while providing private sanctuary. A villa in an established resort is luxurious because it connects to social networks and recreational options. But luxury in isolation is just quality materials in empty space. Without the network effects, social proof, and community infrastructure that give context to luxury, it's architecture without purpose. The project offered physical luxury, the materials, the finishes, the systems, but it couldn't offer contextual luxury because the context required occupants it didn't have. This created a recursive trap. Occupants wouldn't come because the project lacked the contextual luxury that attracted them, but contextual luxury couldn't exist without occupants. The project needed to be successful to become successful. Developers sometimes solve this by pre-selling sufficient units to reach critical mass before opening, or by phasing construction so early phases can establish occupancy before later phases complete. This project had taken a different path, building at full scale and assuming sales would follow. The assumption proved fatal. Completion locked in costs and obligations. It eliminated flexibility. It transformed the project from controllable construction process into fixed asset with fixed requirements. Had the project been left partially complete, options would exist. Construction could pause. Designs could be revised. Different uses could be considered. But completion narrowed possibilities to a single option. Find buyers willing to purchase units as designed at prices that covered costs. Those buyers never materialized in sufficient numbers, and completion ensured there was no plan B. The project demonstrated that in real estate development, timing matters as much as quality. Finishing too early before market demand was proven created vulnerability. The buildings were complete, but the business wasn't. Everything necessary for occupancy existed. Everything except the occupants themselves. And without occupants, completion was meaningless. The project was finished. It was just finished in a way that made it unusable. Nothing broke. Everything simply waited. Traditional abandonment is visible. Buildings deteriorate. Windows break. Nature reclaims landscaping. This project abandoned differently. Systems continued running. Security patrolled. Maintenance occurred on reduced schedules. Exteriors stayed clean. The abandonment was functional rather than physical. The project had been abandoned as a going concern while being preserved as an asset. Costs continued, but at reduced levels. A skeleton crew kept critical systems running. The monthly operating loss was substantial but not catastrophic. Lenders accepted this arrangement because foreclosing would make them responsible. Owners accepted it because walking away meant losing all equity. The few occupied residents existed in a bizarre situation. They lived in luxury buildings that were functionally abandoned. They had paid for amenities that were closed. They had expected community that never formed. The project was trapped in what could be called zombie development. Not alive in any meaningful sense, but not dead enough to dispose of. Continuing to consume resources without generating returns. The most likely long-term outcome was eventual foreclosure when reserves exhausted, followed by lender-forced sale at whatever price the market would bear. But that remained future speculation. In the present, the project simply existed. Towers standing in desert sunlight, systems humming in empty buildings, guards patrolling empty corridors. The abandonment was polite, orderly, and absolute. Once people disappear, only spreadsheets remain. The project's existence shifted from physical reality to financial abstraction. It became primarily a series of entries on balance sheets, income statements, and tax documents. For the developer, the project represented an asset carried at specific value. That value bore increasingly tenuous relationship to market reality, but accounting rules allowed latitude in valuing completed but unstabilized real estate. Writing down the asset would trigger consequences throughout the corporate structure. For lenders, the project appeared as performing loans. As long as borrowers maintained payments, even from reserves, the loans weren't classified as impaired. Both sides understood the fiction, but preferred extending and pretending to, forcing issues that would require acknowledging losses. Tax treatment added complexity. Development costs created basis. Depreciation generated paper losses. Operating losses offset other income. Each exit strategy triggered distinct tax consequences across corporate structures. Investors who provided equity faced their own accounting choices. Writing down investments required acknowledging impaired capital. That affected reported returns and how investment managers were evaluated. The result was gradual downward adjustment. Each quarter, reported values declined slightly without triggering alarm. The project's financial abstraction allowed it to continue existing in records even as its physical reality stagnated. On paper, it remained an asset, an investment, a project in development. The numbers that appeared in financial statements bore minimal connection to walking through empty towers. They represented a parallel reality where the project was valued not for what it was, but for what accounting conventions required it to appear to be. Spreadsheets captured costs and valuations and projections. What they couldn't capture was the absence, the vacant units, the silent corridors, the pools reflecting only sky. Numbers can represent anything. The spreadsheets chose functioning community while reality insisted on empty monument. And in that gap, billions existed in a state neither fully lost nor recoverable. Rescue required admitting the project should never have existed. In theory, solutions existed. Capital markets are creative. Real estate professionals are resourceful. But theory met reality at an impasse. Dramatic price reduction was the straightforward solution. Price units at market clearing levels. Accept losses. Move inventory. This failed because it required coordinated acceptance of massive losses. Lenders would write off portions of loans. Equity investors would face total wipeout. The developer would acknowledge comprehensive failure that would impair reputation permanently. Alternative use conversion offered another path: convert units to apartments, corporate housing, or hospitality. This failed because the project wasn't designed for alternative uses, and conversion required massive additional capital. More fundamentally, the same location problems that limited residential sales would limit any alternative use. Finding a white-knight investor was attempted. This failed because sophisticated investors conduct due diligence. They'd identify the same problems. At prices reflecting realistic risk, current stakeholders would lose everything. At prices protecting stakeholders, investors wouldn't find adequate returns. Time-based solutions assumed market conditions would improve. This failed because time wasn't free. Each month cost money, reserves depleted, deferred maintenance accumulated. Meanwhile, markets weren't static. Other developments emerged. Buyer preferences continued evolving. The window that might have supported this project had closed permanently. Government intervention might have provided support. This failed because governments had limited incentive to rescue private failures. Public resources bailing out wealthy developers was politically toxic. The project's failure didn't create local hardship because it never employed significant local population. Every solution confronted the same fundamental problem. The project was built on assumptions that proved false. It created supply without corresponding demand. Salvaging it required either changing the product or changing the market. The product was fixed. The market was beyond anyone's control. The project couldn't be saved because saving it required admitting it shouldn't have been built. That admission was more expensive than anyone was willing to pay. The towers stood, perfect and useless, rescued from nothing, saved for no one. This project isn't ruined. It's trapped. Ownership continued, titles remained registered, corporate entities still existed. Lenders held mortgages, but ownership had become burden rather than asset. Selling required a buyer, but buyers demanded prices that would crystallize losses too large for sellers to accept. The gap between what sellers needed and what buyers would pay was billions. Walking away wasn't viable because ownership came with obligations that abandonment wouldn't eliminate. So ownership persisted by default. Taxes paid, though sometimes negotiated. Insurance maintained. Essential services continued. The project was owned in the sense that legal title existed, but it wasn't controlled. It dictated terms to owners rather than owners dictating terms to it. The few occupied residents were also trapped. They had purchased units at prices that couldn't be recovered. The resale market was non-existent. Residents who wanted to exit faced binary choices, accept losses of 60, 70, perhaps 80% of purchase price, or stay in a deteriorating situation. The Homeowners Association had responsibilities but limited power. It couldn't compel proper funding. It couldn't force unit sales. Association meetings were exercises in frustration with no solutions, because solutions didn't exist within limited authority. The project illustrated how real estate ownership can become a prison. Property that should be an asset became an obligation impossible to satisfy and impossible to exit. Maintenance couldn't be eliminated without destroying value, but maintaining consumed resources without generating returns. This trap was specific to completed real estate in isolated locations. The project couldn't be moved, easily repurposed, or held cheaply. Everyone involved was trapped by a project that was complete, functional, and economically unviable. The project was owned, maintained, and unused, and in that state, it would likely remain. History is full of luxury projects that failed for the same reason. The pattern repeats across time and geography. Developers build luxury projects on optimistic assumptions. Projects complete. Markets fail to materialize. Projects become monuments to miscalculation. In Spain, entire towns were built during the property boom of the 2000s. Thousands of units completed. The developments were meant to house growth that never came. They stood empty for years, becoming ghost towns, documenting speculative excess. In China, entire cities were constructed anticipating urbanization that didn't materialize. Massive residential developments rose in remote locations for populations that remained in established urban centers. Towers stood empty. Infrastructure served virtually no one. Dubai saw luxury development struggle when markets softened. Palm-shaped islands housing luxury villas couldn't sustain demand. Projects meant for hundreds of wealthy families instead housed dozens. The common thread is scale disconnected from demand. Developers see successful luxury projects and assume they can replicate success. They underestimate how specific local conditions enabled previous success and how finite the luxury market actually is. Luxury markets are thin by definition. Only a small percentage can afford luxury prices. Building luxury at scale assumes vast, untapped demand, or that quality creates demand where none existed. The projects that fail share characteristics. Isolated locations assuming amenities compensate for remoteness. Premium pricing assuming brand justifies price disconnected from alternatives. Scale assuming proportional demand exists. The mistakes are predictable, yet they repeat because incentive structures reward optimism. Developers generate fees from projects getting built regardless of outcome. Lenders earn interest protected by collateral. Contractors bill for work regardless of results. This project wasn't unique. It was emblematic. Another luxury development that looked viable on spreadsheets, but encountered market reality that didn't conform to projections. Somewhere, another luxury project is being planned. The numbers will look compelling. The analysis will appear thorough. And likely the fundamental dynamics that doomed this project will be present there too. The pattern continues. The project worked perfectly, just not as a place for people. Understanding what this project actually accomplished requires abandoning the assumption that it was meant to house residents. It generated employment during construction. Thousands of workers received wages. Contractors earned fees. Suppliers sold materials. For several years, the project moved economic activity through systems that depend on such movement. From that perspective, the project succeeded. It converted capital into labor and materials. Those workers spent wages. Those suppliers paid their own workers. Economic activity rippled through regions touched by procurement and construction. That the project then failed to generate ongoing economic activity through occupancy is separate from the economic impact of construction itself. It generated fees and returns for various intermediaries. Architects earned design fees, engineers earned consulting fees, marketing firms earned commissions, legal teams billed hours. Every profession touching the project extracted value during its development. These parties profited regardless of whether the project ultimately succeeded. The building got built, the services were rendered, the fees were paid. From the perspective of professional service providers, the project worked exactly as intended. It provided tax deductions and accounting benefits. Development costs created losses that offset other income. Depreciation generated paper losses with real tax value. Complex ownership structures allowed tax optimization across various jurisdictions. For sophisticated investors, the project might have generated tax benefits that partially offset economic losses. Not enough to make it worthwhile, but enough to reduce the pain. It generated fees for financial institutions. Lenders earned origination fees, interest during construction, and various other charges. Investment banks earned fees structuring deals. Advisory firms earned fees providing opinions and analysis. Financial intermediaries extracted value from moving capital into the project, and, eventually, from restructuring when things went wrong. The project's failure didn't mean they didn't profit. It transferred capital from certain parties to others. Equity investors lost capital, but that capital went somewhere. It went to contractors, suppliers, workers, consultants, and lenders. Capital movement is neutral. From one perspective, investment was lost. From another, capital was distributed through the economy to parties who provided goods and services. The project converted financial capital into physical capital. Buildings exist now that didn't exist before. Those buildings have value, even if far less than construction cost. At some price, they'll eventually sell. Some capital will be recovered. Physical infrastructure was created. Roads, utilities, landscaping exist where they didn't before. These have value to future owners regardless of whether the current project succeeds. Most fundamentally, the project served a purpose deeply embedded in capitalism. It absorbed excess capital-seeking returns. Wealthy individuals and institutions accumulate capital faster than productive investment opportunities emerge. That capital seeks deployment. Real estate development offers one mechanism for absorbing large capital pools. Whether particular projects succeed is almost secondary to the system-level function of absorbing capital that would otherwise sit idle or inflate asset prices in established markets. From this perspective, the project worked perfectly. It absorbed billions, employed that capital for several years, generated fees and wages, and created physical assets that persist even if they don't generate projected returns. The project failed as residential, community. It failed as investment. It failed to house people or generate operating returns. But it succeeded as mechanism for moving capital through economic systems. It succeeded in providing temporary employment. It succeeded in generating fees for intermediaries. This isn't cynicism. It's recognition that real estate development serves multiple functions simultaneously. Housing people is one function, but employing people, absorbing capital, generating fees, and creating physical infrastructure are equally real functions. The project's failure to house residents is failure only from certain perspectives. From others, it performed exactly as economic systems require. It provided work when work was needed. It deployed capital when capital sought deployment. It distributed wealth from investors to workers and suppliers. It created physical assets where none existed. That those assets now sit largely empty is unfortunate for equity investors who expected returns. But it doesn't negate the other outcomes the project generated. The towers standing vacant represent different things to different observers. To investors, failed expectations. To workers, wages earned. To contractors, projects completed. To lenders, collateral of uncertain value. To communities, construction activity that provided temporary economic lift. No single perspective captures the full meaning. The project is simultaneously failure and success, depending on who is evaluating and against what criteria. What it isn't is surprising. Projects like this fail regularly. Capital seeks returns. Intermediaries facilitate deployment. Physical projects get built. Some succeed, many don't. The pattern is structural, embedded in how capitalism organizes investment and development. As long as capital accumulates and seeks deployment, projects will be built on optimistic assumptions. Some of those assumptions will prove correct. Others won't. This project proved assumptions wrong, but it proved them wrong after absorbing capital, employing labor, and creating infrastructure. From certain angles, that's precisely what it was supposed to do. The lights turn on every night. The elevators wait. The marble floors reflect empty ceilings. And in the silence, the project performs its final function, standing as evidence that even when everything goes exactly as planned, the plan itself might have been wrong. The dream is complete, perfectly executed, precisely wrong. And in that contradiction lies the real story of what was built here.